Well, Jesus makes all sorts of beautiful promises to us in the Bible. He promises that if we abide in him, and this is also earlier in John 15, if we abide in him, he promises to abide in us. Jesus promises that if we have the faith of a mustard seed, we can move mountains. Jesus promises that whatever we ask in his name, it will be given to us. If we follow God's commands, Jesus promises that his joy will be in us and our joy will be made complete. Jesus came so that we may have life and have it abundantly. We are told in Matthew that if we come to Jesus and we're carrying heavy burdens, that he will give us rest. Now, these are beautiful promises. They're the sorts of promises that work their way onto coffee mugs and t-shirts and magnets, and with good reason, because we need to see them often and remember what they say. We need to memorize these verses and plaster them on our refrigerator or our mirror, and we need to bind them and treasure them in our hearts so that we have them for when the tough times come. Jesus made a lot of powerful promises to us, good and beautiful promises. Throughout the New Testament, we see Jesus bringing healing and hope and adventure to all who follow him. There is great delight in following the one who loves us more than we can ever imagine, and the one who offers us forgiveness and grace no matter what. There is great delight in following Jesus. Life with Jesus is amazing. And life with Jesus is hard. It's really hard because you see there are other promises that are made in our reading today that are a bit more troubling. Jesus promises that the world will hate us, that the world will persecute us, that he did not come to bring peace, but a sword. That's from Matthew 10:26. If any want to become Christ's followers, we are told that we must deny ourselves, take up our cross, and follow him. That's from Mark 8:34. You see, there are just as many hard promises as there are good and beautiful ones. And these don't make their way onto t-shirts or coffee mugs, do they? They're a little more difficult to process, these promises. It's much harder to realize that a life of faith doesn't always lead to peace and joy and hope and prosperity. Sometimes a life of faith leads us to difficulty and persecution. After getting over the shock and the horror of learning that the world will hate us because of Jesus, I actually find these promises to be refreshing. Now, that may not strike you that way immediately, but think about it. Isn't it nice, or at least good, that Jesus promised that life would be hard? Because guess what? It is hard. All of you sitting in this room either have experienced hardship or are currently experiencing hardship. And if you somehow managed to avoid either of those first two categories, there will be someday when you will experience hardship. And I think it's really hopeful, refreshing that Jesus promised that there would be these times, that Jesus wasn't trying to sugarcoat or lie to us, follow me, and then you get in and it's harder than you thought. But instead, there is this honesty that Jesus has that yes, indeed, life is hard. That a life of faith isn't always easy, that people will get angry with you. There's no way around this. When you say to your friends, well, I can't go out tonight because I promised to do this thing at church, you may experience a small amount of pushback and persecution. If you work really hard to get rid of your pride, to get rid of your selfishness, if you work to exercise all those things out of your life and practice those spiritual disciplines to get rid of those those evil things, then you will experience difficulty. When you decide that you can't abide by an unjust law because it hurts God's people, you will feel persecution. I think one of the ways that we know that Jesus is real and that Jesus is trustworthy is that he promised us not only a life of happiness, but he told us there will be times when following me will be hard, when others won't like what you do in my name. It will be hard. Now, with the promise of persecution in hand, we have to consider, how do we handle this persecution? How do we bear it when, as the song said, the storms of life are raging? How do we go forward? Well, one powerful example of how to bear persecution, I think, is found in Abraham Lincoln. That was the movie that we chose for this week, Lincoln. And as we watched it, you can see that Lincoln is struggling. The whole movie centers around the passage of the 13th Amendment. And so for those of you who haven't studied Civil War history recently, here's the way it worked. 1864 was the second to the last year of the Civil War. And so in January of 1864, the Senate passed the 13th Amendment. Then it went to the House, and it failed. It did not pass. And then there was an election. Abraham Lincoln had to get reelected in the middle of a civil war, but he was reelected. And in this time then, between the November election and between January when the new members came in, Lincoln realized there was an opportunity. There were lame duck representatives that were no longer going to worry about whether or not they'd be reelected because they'd already lost that. And so Lincoln said they can now vote their conscience. And he works so hard throughout this movie to try to pass this amendment. But in every faction, he experiences pushback. There are liberals who say that the amendment doesn't go far enough. It doesn't do enough for slaves. And there are conservatives that say, oh my goodness, we can't possibly stand this. It's too far. We can't do this. There are people who are in his cabinet that say, if you don't try to pass this amendment, the Civil War could be over next week. You could broker a peace deal. The South will come back if you don't keep flinging around this 13th Amendment. And so Lincoln has to wrestle with this idea of, do I push forward on this or not? All around him, he hears varying voices and feels the weight of this decision. And while Lincoln struggles on how to proceed, one thing seems to remain clear. He believes that all men are created equal. This appears in his speech at Gettysburg. It appears in his second inaugural address. It is this fundamental belief that leads him forward and continues to push this amendment through, his asking his cabinet to support him, asking the House to vote for it. He continues to push because he's clear on what he believes. The other thing that's portrayed in this movie is Lincoln's ability to listen. He deeply desires to pass this amendment, but he also takes time to listen to the opposing sides. He knows that there's a timeline that he needs to pass the amendment, but he takes time and even risks listening to groups that others wouldn't want him to listen to. He listens to each group and demonstrates great humility and patience. Now, in this, demonstrating humility, only once in the movie does he really pull out the stops and say, I'm the president of the United States. I am the one who has power here, and I can do great things. Only once does he actually say that. The rest of the time we see him acting as very humble. And so in this, being clear on fundamental beliefs, practicing humility, and practicing patience, we see qualities that Jesus also had in his ministry and his leadership. You see, Jesus was very clear about who he was and why he came. He did not waver during the difficult times. And he was very clear that he came always to seek and save the lost. He came to share God's love with the world. He came to show us what God's love looked like, and that nothing, not even the persecution and death, could stop God's love. When Jesus' disciples warn him not to go to Bethany to visit Mary and Martha after Lazarus dies, Jesus goes anyway because he's clear about who he is and what he's to do. He knows that this is an opportunity to share God's great love with Mary and Martha and Lazarus and the crowd. When it comes to Jesus being clear on who he was and what gave him strength, there's a powerful quote that I found in a book by Philip Yancey called Prayer. And he quotes and shares the words of Hayden Robinson. He says, "Where was it that Jesus sweat great drops of blood?" Do you remember that part of the story? The scriptures tell us that he was so stressed, so anxious, that he actually sweat drops of blood. Where was it that he did that? Not Pilate's Hall, not on his way to Golgotha. It was in the Garden of Gethsemane. There he offered up prayers and petitions with loud cries to the one who could save him from death. And Robinson writes, and this is what I find really profound, he says, "If I had been there and witnessed that struggle, I would have worried about the future. If he is so broken up when all he's doing is praying, I might have said, what will he do when he faces the real crisis? Why can't he approach this ordeal with the calm confidence of his friends?" But when the test came, Jesus walked to the cross with courage, and his 3 friends fell apart and fell away. You see, Jesus did the real work, the strong work of the battle in prayer, because he took the time to pray, because he wasn't rushed into doing and fighting. He took that time to pray. He was clear about who he was and what his mission was. And he was able to go to the cross with unwavering strength in the face of persecution. This moment of taking time to pray also tells us something about Jesus. He was able to be patient. He did not rush through his ministry, but he often said, "My time has not yet come." He knew how important it was to take time to pray. And so before he endured all of these trials, going through the flogging and the crucifixion, he took that time to pray. Jesus also shows humility. He has immense power, but he does not use it to fight against Rome. He tells the disciples that he could have, if he desired, unleashed angel armies to fight for him in the garden, but he didn't. He endured the cross without anger, no matter how much it hurt. Jesus knew that the world was not perfect. He knew that there would be hard days ahead. As long as there is sin in this world, things will go wrong. People will suffer through intentional and unintentional persecution. The world may hate you, but it hated Jesus first. Jesus, you see, has not left us to endure this persecution in isolation. Jesus promises to walk with us through the hard times. And Jesus has given us a pattern for how to endure persecution. First, we must be clear on our mission and our values. We must be clear on who God is and what it is that God's calling us to do. And I think it's important to remember that God will never call you to do anything that violates his character of love. So God isn't going to call you to murder someone or to lie or steal or cheat, but God will call you to places that are difficult and hard. Second, we need to be patient and we need to listen. Far too many bad decisions are made in haste and anger. Jesus teaches us to take time in prayer first and act decisively second. Third, we need humility. Yes, we are heirs of God's kingdom, and we are given power and authority to serve God, and yet we need to remember that Jesus didn't ride into Jerusalem on a great white charger bringing war with angel armies behind him. Instead, he came in on a donkey, symbolizing peace. Jesus went to great lengths to make certain that each person, every single one of us, had the opportunity to decide on our own without force or coercion to follow him. In the end, perhaps the most important lesson is this: that when troubles come, when persecution comes, do not think that God has abandoned you. Do not panic and think that you are alone. Remember that Jesus warned us that persecution was to come. Jesus prayed for us, And Jesus promises to go with us all the way home. Amen.